Okay, so chapter 6 of the interior beginnings of voluntary motions, commonly called the passions, and the speeches by which they are expressed. So here, this is basically Hobbesian psychology. He's going to talk about the passions, the interior emotions within the body, but also within the self. The passions as we experience them mentally, and then the speeches, in other words, the names that we use to express them. And this is important because, again, Hobbes, as he said in chapter 5, for instance, reasoning is a matter of getting precise definitions and then building on those definitions. He presents it as if it's a lot like math, like you're just sort of adding and subtracting from definitions. But the key point is that your definitions need to be precise and clear, but also accurate. So if his definitions, if his understanding of the passions and of what people are actually experiencing when they express them and when they express these experiences in these words, if his understanding of these things is off or incorrect, then that will create problems for his whole system. In particular, if they're too reductive, if they're too pat, if they basically don't explain enough of what actually happens. When you say something is reductive or reductionist or something, what that means in the context of philosophy is you're taking something that seems complicated and maybe in a sense higher, but in any case, more complicated, and reducing it to something relatively simple. So it's something that Hobbes does a lot, for instance, with power. Emotions, passions, experiences, concerns, and so on, that may seem to be fairly complicated, maybe about different things, and maybe about more sort of disinterested and non-selfish concerns. Hobbes will often come back and reduce to simple calculations of power between people. And if he's wrong about that, if there are things there that he's missing, then that creates a problem for his theory, a problem for his political philosophy, because the whole idea is his philosophy is proper reasoning, proper reckoning on the basis of correct definitions. Now, we'll see, we'll get into this a little bit later, Hobbes may come back and say, look, maybe they're not exactly precise or perfect. Just like in science, not all definitions are completely exhaustive or completely perfect or definitive, but they are effective. They are close enough and they capture what's really important for building these scientific theories, for building these ways of sort of controlling and modifying things and so on. And he might say, my definitions of people's, people psychologically, of people's passions and so on, my definitions are the same way. But we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So here, fairly early on here in this chapter, he basically makes this very crucial point that basically he says good and bad are basically relative. We say things are good, we say things are bad, we usually mean these, or at least often mean these statements or judgments in an absolute sense that this is good, this is bad, this is right, that's wrong. But Hobbes says really our own opinions about these things change throughout our own life, and of course there's great disagreement among different people about what's right and wrong. So Hobbes says ultimately good and bad are simply relative. There's nothing absolutely or simply good or bad, based on itself as it is in itself. There's nothing that's always absolutely good or bad for everyone. It's only relative to an individual and to an individual's taste, or after you have the law established, to a code of laws. So once you have an actual society and an actual law code, that set of laws tells you this is right, this is wrong, and then it's no longer arbitrary. It's not because now the code of laws isn't getting at the absolute or the inherent truth of the matter, but they are establishing a standard of right and wrong that is then binding on the people who accept those laws, who live under those laws, and therefore, again, it's no longer simply arbitrary at that point. Good and bad have been established. But let's look at what Hobbes himself says, section 6, or paragraph 6 here of chapter 6. And because the constitution of a man's body is in continual mutation, it is impossible that all the same things should always cause in him the same appetites and aversions, much less that all men consent in the desire of almost any one and the same object. So he says, your body is in continual mutation. Again, Hobbes traces everything back to the body. Since your body is in constant mutation, constant motion, but also constant change, it's impossible that the same thing should always cause in you the same appetites, the same aversions. Let's take a simple example. When you're a child, very sugary candy tastes very good. As you get older, it doesn't really taste that good anymore. It's too sweet. You don't really like it. When you're a child, probably you don't like coffee. Hopefully you're not drinking alcohol, cigarettes. These are things that don't taste good to you at all. Eventually you acquire a taste for them. When you're an adult, things that tasted good when you were a child no longer taste good. And things that would have seemed disgusting if you had tried them when you were a child now taste good. So Hobbes, that's an example of just your literal taste in food changes, your taste in drinks changes. And so he says, that's something that changes throughout life, and it's the same way with all of our other beliefs. Not to offend anybody who had children in high school or anything, but for most people, when you're in high school, you're thinking that the last thing that you want is to get pregnant, or to have somebody or you're dating get pregnant through you. So the last thing you want is to be starting a family when you're 15 or 16. 10 or 15 years later, maybe a lot of people start to think, okay, I think I want to settle down, start a family, and they're sort of looking for that situation that in the past, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, seemed so terrifying. Now it seems desirable. It seems like that's what they want. 10 or 15 years after that, they're thinking, I have to get out of this thing. People's desires, their experiences, everything keeps changing, and therefore what seems good to them keeps changing. And Hobbes, he doesn't really get into it here, but the problem is that people are so proud, so vainglorious, as he puts it, that they can't admit that. They can't admit that, well, things just keep changing. My own beliefs about what's good and bad just keep changing. They have to think that somehow their own beliefs are connected to reality in a truer sense than other people's, including their own previous selves. So they have, rather than saying, well, when I was 15, of course it wasn't reasonable for me to want to start a family, but what I thought was good then was good for me at the time. It wasn't that I was immature or foolish or anything like that. I had reasonable beliefs for a 15-year-old. Now that I'm 30, I have reasonable beliefs for a 30-year-old, and then moving on, when I'm 45, I have reasonable beliefs. I mean, maybe they're not always reasonable for various reasons, but it's not that people insist on, I'm maturing, I know better now, I see how things really are. And Hobbes says, no, you don't. You're just changing, and you'll continue to change. But human pride means that we can't accept that, and we have to say that somehow what we believe is true, and is truer than what we believed in the past. And of course, that's even more the case when we compare our own beliefs to other people. When other people disagree with us, we have to say, well, there's just something wrong with you then. For the most part, people don't do this with actual taste in food. If I like chocolate ice cream and someone else likes vanilla, for the most part, we just recognize. Of course, some people do. Some people get very upset about certain types of food, and they're very disturbed that somebody might like that. But for the most part, people understand food. Taste in food is largely subjective, just a matter of personal taste and so on. No one gets too excited about that. But when we see people disagreeing about other things, then oftentimes people get more emotional and more upset when they see that people maybe don't share their beliefs about what's good. People who don't want to have children, oftentimes. People who do say, what's wrong with you? Why don't you want to have children? And people who don't want to have children say, well, what's wrong with you? It's why would anybody want to have children? Why would anybody want all those things? Rather than just saying, yeah, we want different things in life. Maybe our opinions will change. But in any case, we've had different experiences. We're different people. We want different things. There's nothing shocking or upsetting about this. There's no reason to be. There's no reason for this to create even mild conflict. People can't accept that. They have to think, no, what I want is what is really true. The good, as it seems to me, is the good as it really is. I see the truth about the world and the way it should be, and people who disagree with me are wrong. And Hobbes says that's not the case. It's just, if only people could accept that, then there would be so much less conflict. So he says, again, good and bad are relative. People change. Their opinions about what are good and bad change. Now, of course, this is where students often have trouble, because what that also means is, of course, that if nothing is inherently good or bad, then that means, morally nothing is inherently good or bad. Murder is justified or not, depending on the way it seems to an individual. And to a large extent, that is what Hobbes is saying, because, again, in the absence of laws, as we'll see, in the absence of law, you have the state of nature. And Hobbes says the state of nature is a war of all against all. The only virtues in that war, he says, are force and fraud. So to some extent, he says that's right. In the state of nature, murder isn't wrong. In fact, it's justified, because you have to do anything you can to protect yourself. It's when society comes along and you start to explain, okay, this is murder, and this is what's not murder. Because again, every society allows people to kill other people. What kind of distinctions or exceptions are they making? Hobbes says, again, that comes down to the law. It's not the way that things really are. It's what the law decides, and individuals would disagree with that. But he says, so he goes on in section 7, he says, but whatsoever is the object of any man's appetite or desire, that is it which he for his part calleth good, and the object of his hate and aversion evil, and of his contempt vile and inconsiderable. For these words of good, evil, and contemptible are never used with relation to the person, are ever used with relation to the person that useth them, there being nothing simply and absolutely so, nor any common rule of good and evil to be taken from the nature of the objects themselves. So again, there's no common rule of good and evil taken from the object of from the nature of the objects themselves, from the nature of the objects that the things are. There's no rule of what's good and what's evil to be taken from the nature of these objects, of these things that people are either desiring or fearing. Hobbes says that there's nothing inherent to these things that make them good for everybody or bad for everybody. It depends on the individual. And he says, so they come not from the objects themselves, these rules of good and evil, but from the person of the man, where there is no commonwealth, or in a commonwealth from the person that representeth it, or from an arbitrator or judge whom men disagreeing shall by consent set up and make his sentence the rule thereof. So again, as we've already talked about, he says, nothing is inherently right or wrong, good or bad. It depends on the individual, and when you have a commonwealth, then the person who represents the commonwealth and makes laws for the society that people have set up to protect them, those laws tell you what is good and what is bad. And people may disagree, but they need to realize that their disagreement is just personal and particular and idiosyncratic, and it's not that they understand the truth and the law has gotten it wrong. Again, there is no universal truth about these things. Therefore, people need to obey the law. So that's what he sort of sets up here in terms of, passions, desire, aversion. What are they? What does it all mean? He sort of says here, well, I mean, again, it's all largely individual, particular, idiosyncratic. People's desires and aversions, their sense of what's good and bad, right and wrong, doesn't come from reality itself, doesn't come from the objects that they're thinking about, from the world. It comes from themselves and their own experience and the way that the world has worked on them and the way that their bodies have changed and the experiences and thoughts and passions and so on that they've had as a result of all of this. And again, if people accept that, then they will be much better citizens and they will accept the rule of law and so on. So he says, that's what the passions are, that's where they come from, but then he goes on to sort of define them. And again, sort of saying, look, the passions, again, are basically particular to the individual, but obviously, this is something he talked about in the introduction, for instance, that the passions are basically the same in everybody. They have different objects, which can make it somewhat confusing, but the passions are basically the same in everybody. So he goes on and he explains many of these things. We'll just look at a few points here. In section 35 or paragraph 35, he talks about curiosity. He says, desire to know why and how, curiosity, such as is in no living creature but man, so that man is distinguished not only by his reason, but also by this singular passion from other animals, in whom the appetite of food and other pleasures of sense by predominance take away the care of knowing causes, which is a lust of the mind that by a perseverance of delight in the continual and indefatigable generation of knowledge exceedeth the short vehemence of any carnal pleasure. So he says animals basically concerned with food, sleep, reproduction, things like that, relatively short-term thinking. They don't know curiosity. They don't have a natural desire to know. He says that's particularly human beings. Human beings sort of think beyond the moment and therefore can find pleasure in knowing. They want to know, that they have a desire to know, to understand things. Aristotle famously said that there's a natural desire to understand in all human beings. Hobbes says, and this is one of the rare cases where he says there is just sort of pure, it has nothing to do with practical advantage. It's not understanding how things work so we can get what we want. He says there is a sort of a desire to know, a curiosity in human beings, which is unique to human beings, and it's just a pleasure in knowing, a desire to understand things. But overall, he sort of downplays this, and curiosity, this sort of relatively selfless desire to know, again, not for practical advantage, but just for the pleasure of knowing, Hobbes, for the most part, doesn't talk about. For the most part, he stresses that human beings think in order to achieve certain ends, to get what they want, basically. The following paragraph, 636, talks about religion and superstition. Fear of power invisible, feigned by the mind or imagined from tales publicly allowed, religion. So here he's sort of introduces his definition of religion. Fear of power invisible. So fear of a power that we can't see but that has control over things. Very simply, the weather, maybe your health. Hobbes says people understand that there are things that cause our good and ill fortune in ways that we can't always control or sometimes can't control at all. The weather, our health, basic things like that. If people don't understand the real causes of these things, then they sort of imagine invisible powers, and they imagine that they're like human beings, these invisible powers. We'll see this later in the chapter on religion, but he sort of introduces it here. Fear of power invisible, fear of some kind of a power that's out there, that's invisible, and that is controlling things that affect us. And so of course, the classic distinction would be between religion and superstition, where religion would be true and superstition are just, ideas that aren't true. Fear of invisible powers, of fairies and spirits, things that don't really exist, and so on. Let's look at how Hobbes makes this distinction between religion and superstition. Fear of power invisible, feigned by the mind, imagined, or imagined from tales publicly allowed, so either invented by someone's own mind or imagined based on, again, tales publicly allowed, religion. So in other words, and then not allowed superstition. So the key distinction for Hobbes is not whether it's true or not, but whether or not it's allowed by the law. Religion is what's allowed by law. Superstition is what's not allowed. He doesn't mention truth at all here. Now, in the next sentence, he says, and when the power imagined is truly such as we imagine, true religion. But again, he sort of really doesn't, as long as the beliefs are allowed by the law, that makes it religion, not superstition. Of course, you might say, well, what matters is whether it's true or not, and the law should be based on whether or not the religion is true. But in any case, the really crucial distinction is between truth and falseness, not between whether or not it's legally allowed. Hobbes obviously focusing, again, as we've kind of seen and seen some of his justification for this, focusing very much on what the law allows, the crucial distinction between religion and superstition, not a matter of truth, a matter of whether or not, of what the law allows and what it doesn't. Okay? Moving on, glorying and vainglory. Again, this is a very important idea for Hobbes. So paragraph 39, joy arising from imagination of a man's own power and ability is that exaltation of the mind which is called glorying. So joy arising from imagination of our own power, our own ability, things that we do well, our ability to do things. He says that's glorying. When we take joy in what we do well, he says that's the experience of glorying. Which, if grounded upon the experience of his own former actions, is the same with confidence. But if grounded on the flattery of others, or only supposed by himself, for delight in the consequences of it, is called vainglory. So this is where you could, and so he basically says if this is founded on actual things that you've done, then it's reasonable confidence. It makes sense. He says if it's founded only on the flattery of others or on your own imagination that you're great without any real evidence, Hobbes says that's vainglory. And he sort of you could think of the distinction between Michael Jordan, who won 6 NBA championships, and LeBron James, who talked about winning more than 6 NBA championships. One is glory when Michael Jordan sort of says certain things. People say, well, but he was Jordan. When LeBron James said that, a lot of people didn't like it because, of course, we won't get into that whole thing. But LeBron James talking about it hadn't done it. That's vainglory. Surrounded by flatterers, has a very high opinion of himself. Until you do it, Hobbes says it's vainglory. You're just imagining. You're just sort of taking pleasure in your own great ability without any real evidence that it exists. It's all just in your mind, and that Hobbes says is vainglory. And he says that's properly given because it's all in vain. And then he basically talks about laughter and weeping. And this is, again, very interesting, very kind of classic Hobbesian psychology. Paragraph 42. Sudden glory is the passion which maketh those grimaces called laughter, and is caused either by some sudden act of our own that pleaseth them, some sudden act of their own that pleaseth them, or by the apprehension of some deformed thing in another, by comparison whereof they suddenly applaud themselves. So basically he says laughter is is based on some sudden glory, some sudden feeling of pleasure about ourselves, because either we've just done something very well, or Hobbes says we see some deformity in somebody else and we sort of applaud ourselves by comparison. In other words, Hobbes is saying, when you're laughing, you're always laughing at somebody else. And of course, obviously, there are many, many jokes that show that Hobbes is onto something here. I mean, many jokes, many times when people are laughing, they are laughing at someone else. They're laughing at someone because they're think of all. I mean, we know what sort of jokes people make. Laughing at somebody because they're stupid or clumsy or can't do things well. All of the ways that people laugh at somebody else, Hobbes says again that what is this about? Why is that funny? Because we're basically thinking I'm better than you in some way, and that makes us happy. He goes on. He says that's why it's actually this is something that happens least of all in better people. He says that the least as he puts it, those who are conscious of the fewest abilities in themselves, he says, spend the most time laughing at other people because that's really their only source of pleasure, their only ability, their only way that they can really feel positive or good about themselves, the only way they can really experience glory in their own abilities, Hobbes says, is by finding someone who's even worse off than they are. They don't have very much experience of succeeding or doing well, so they can't really glory in that, so they have to glory in mocking somebody else, seeing someone else who's not doing well. He says those who really do well, they laugh in this way very little. They realize what's right is to try to help people, not to laugh at them, and so on. And if they're confident, if they do things that are well themselves, then they don't need to laugh in that way in any case. Now, you might say this is a little bit too reductionist. Students usually resist this. They don't like, again, reductionist. The idea, well, laughter, there are so many different reasons you might laugh. laugh, are we really always just laughing at someone else? Is this really all that laughter is? Is this really all that sense of humor is? Is just again, laughing at somebody, either taking pleasure in ourselves and thinking that we're great, or taking pleasure in ourselves in the kind of roundabout way of laughing at someone else. You might say, isn't that too reductionist? Aren't you taking a fairly complicated experience and reducing it to one simple thing, pleasure in our own power or in our own ability and so on? You can think, for instance, that students usually resist this right here. They usually don't like this idea. One of the least successful examples of a student resisting this, once a student said, "That's not true. When I laugh at people, when I laugh, I'm not just laughing at somebody." And I said, "Well, when was the last time that you really laughed at something?" And she said, "Well, the other day at work, this old lady fell on the ice in the parking lot, and I laughed at her." So it was, not successful at all. That's obviously a perfect example of what Hobbes is talking about. You see an old person slip on the ice and fall, and you laugh at them. Clearly, this is a perfect example of what Hobbes is saying. You're laughing at them because they fell, and sort of applauding yourself by extension or by implication, sort of thinking, "Haha, I didn't fall on the ice." And here's where he would say, look, if you're doing relatively well yourself, you probably don't laugh at that. You probably don't need to, applaud yourself for not slipping on the ice. And so that would be a good illustration of what Hobbes is talking about. And he's clearly onto something here. Obviously, again, a lot of times when people laugh, they are laughing, for this reason in this way. But there are all kinds of people laugh at absurd things. And of course, people oftentimes laugh at things that when things are said that usually you can't say. There's a lot of sort of bawdy jokes and things like that. There's this sort of constant pressure not to talk about certain things, not to acknowledge certain things, and sometimes just talking about them or acknowledging them is funny because it sort of breaks that tension, and you're not really laughing at anybody, you're laughing at that sense of release from that pressure, not to discuss certain things, not to acknowledge certain realities, that you have to spend a lot of time suppressing a basic reality. And when somebody actually points it out, especially in a relatively clever way, you laugh because of the release of that pressure, the ability to finally acknowledge that reality that you were supposed to not be acknowledging. Again, a lot of earthy humor is this way. So again, you might say, but Hobbes, this isn't true. You're making things too simplistic, and therefore that's a problem for your definition, and it's a problem for your understanding of human nature. And in that case, your definitions are off, and therefore your whole political science will be off. And Hobbes might come back and say, maybe, that yes, there are going to be exceptions, but the exceptions are not frequent enough and are not significant enough for me to really have to worry about here. In terms of understanding how people normally act, and therefore how politics is and how politics should be, most of the time people are of this sort. Most people, if you watch, just watch late night television, watch the monologues, see what kind of jokes people laugh at, usually they are laughing at people. Hobbes might say, that this is, for the most part, this is really a fairly accurate idea of how people act. So anyways, moving on to his definition of weeping, he says, on the contrary, sudden dejection is the passion that causeth weeping, and is caused by such accidents as suddenly take away some vehement hope or some prop of their power. And they are most subject to it that rely principally on helps external, such as our women and children. So he says, weeping is sudden dejection caused by the loss of some kind of vehement hope that we had, or some prop of our power. He says, therefore, women in his day obviously had almost no political or social rights or civil rights. So he says, people like women and children who are dependent on other people cry the most because they have the least amount of control over themselves and their own power. They have to rely on other people. Therefore, their hopes, their sense of their own power are frequently taken away, and therefore they're more prone to crying. So he says, therefore some weep for the loss of friends. So some weep when a friend dies, for instance. And Hobbes says, again, it's not so much that you're weeping because they were such a good person and you're going to miss them, but because you feel like you've lost either some hope you had or some prop of your power, that in some way or another the loss of this friend affects you in a way that, again, is ultimately fairly selfish. Others for their unkindness. Obviously some people weep because their friends are unkind to them. Friendships end and so on. Others for the sudden stop made to their thoughts of revenge by reconciliation. So he goes on. So he says, some people cry when two friends reconcile. He says sometimes they cry. Hobbes says it's not because they're so happy to be back together, those aren't tears of joy. Those are tears because they had plans to avenge themselves, and now they have to give up those plans. And those plans for revenge were so sweet, and they took such pleasure in them, and they put so much hope into them that Hobbes says it's very sad that they have to give them up. And so therefore they cry. Again, obviously sort of classic Hobbesian psychology here. Again, you might say, aren't you going a little bit too far? But overall, that's how he's presenting these things. That's how he's presenting weeping in particular. Other interesting parts, the definitions of pity and cruelty. He says pity is when we basically see somebody suffer and we can imagine that suffering for ourselves. And so he says, that's sort of, as he calls it, there are sort of different terms for it, fellow feeling and so on. But he says, and so he says, when we see somebody else suffering, and we can imagine ourselves suffering in that same way, that's pity, that's passion, grief for the calamity of another, as he puts it. He says, therefore, for calamity arising from great wickedness, the best men have the least pity, and for the same calamity, those have least pity that think themselves least obnoxious to it. So, for instance, he says basically when you see people suffering because, take an example, because of they're being punished by the law or something, Hobbes says the best men, the people who are least likely to actually, when you see people suffering as a consequence of their own vices and so on, Hobbes says the best people will have the least pity for them because they can't imagine themselves suffering from those vices. If somebody loses all of their money gambling and you can't ever imagine yourself doing that, Hobbes says you won't have much sympathy for them because you can't imagine yourself in you can't imagine yourself in their situation. And likewise, if you see somebody suffer from something that isn't their fault, but you still just can't really imagine yourself in that situation, Hobbes says you won't feel any real pity. You won't feel any real suffering. Now, you might say, but people are concerned about people who are suffering things that clearly they won't. And when people protest oppressive governments in other countries, sometimes they've had experience of that, but oftentimes the people protesting don't live in those countries. They don't live in countries with oppressive governments at all. And Hobbes might say, but then they're not really motivated by pity or by the feeling of compassion or sympathy. They're motivated by ideas about what's right and wrong. And so it's not really pity or compassion in that case. And then he goes on, he says cruelty, and in a way cruelty is especially interesting because given how bleak, how violent Hobbes describes the state of nature, his definition of cruelty is interesting. Section 47, contempt or little sense of the calamity of others is that which men call cruelty. So he says, what is cruelty? Is it pleasure in harming another? Is it pleasure in causing another person pain? He says, no, it's contempt or little sense, just indifference basically to their calamity, to their own suffering. He says, proceeding from security of their own fortune. For that any man should take pleasure in other men's great harms without other end of his own, I do not conceive it possible. So as dark as human nature is for Hobbes, or at least as it seems to be in chapter 13 when he describes the state of nature, here he says basically when it comes to the idea of cruelty, what is it? He says cruelty is just indifference to other people's suffering because you feel so secure yourself. Therefore, you can't sort of think of how it feels for other people. Therefore, you're indifferent to their suffering. Hobbes says he can't conceive it possible that people actually just take pleasure in other people's pain or in other people's suffering. He says without some other end of their own. So you might take pleasure in harming somebody to get something from them that you want, and again, you're being cruel in the sense of basically just being callous. But Hobbes says the idea that people actually want to harm each other and somehow take pleasure in that or think that that's some good thing, Hobbes says I can't really imagine that that's possible. So you see, a lot of what it is then, a lot of the conflict that he's so concerned about in sometimes in society, in the state of nature, the conflict arising from vainglory, it's not so much a matter that people enjoy hurting each other and therefore are just sadistic or destructive for its own sake. The issue for Hobbes is that people think that they're somehow immune to the suffering that they see other people undergoing and that they see themselves causing to other people. They think God is on my side. So although I just saw what happened to that person, that's not going to happen to me because I'm somehow secure. I'm somehow safe. I'm protected by something that's going to stop me from suffering what all of these other people do, suffering what I see all these other people having to go through. So Hobbes says, that's the real source of cruelty is just too strong a sense of security. And therefore people are willing to harm for other ends, not for the end or the purpose of harming, but for something else that they want. But they become indifferent to the suffering of other people. But you can see how, therefore, if people are a little bit more aware of their own frailty, their own vulnerability, and a little bit less inclined to, and a little bit more aware of how other people suffer, you might be able to change human behavior quite a bit. Make people less prone to be vainglorious, to think that they're somehow secure from any kind of harm, make them more aware of how people, and therefore, following from that, if you make them more aware that, that person over there who just got blown up in this civil war, that could have been you, then they'll not only be less aggressive and less vainglorious, less cruel themselves, they'll be more compassionate to other people. They'll think more about, we really shouldn't do this. So again, interesting, because it says, what is cruelty? Is it pleasure in harming others or in being destructive or something? No, he says it's indifference based on a strong sense of your own security. And again, you can see where, based on other things that he talks about, it comes from vainglory, from a sense of somehow being secure, somehow being protected by some higher power or something. And not even that people necessarily articulate it in that way, but just having this expectation that they're somehow secure, that they're somehow protected in some way. And Hobbes says, that's cruelty, just indifference to the suffering of others. Okay, and so he sort of sums up a lot of what he means by one more brief interesting thing. He criticizes Aquinas' notion of the will as a rational appetite in paragraph 53. Basically says, if the will is a rational appetite, then you can never will against reason. But of course you can. So he says, it doesn't make any sense to say that the will is a rational appetite. Again, we saw Aquinas sort of has different ideas, but Hobbes also, of course, then saying reason doesn't identify the good. The will is not a rational appetite. The will, you just will whatever you desire. The will is just whatever the last desire is before you act. And again, the will is not a rational appetite because reason is not identifying the good, and then will is not following what reason says to pursue the good. Again, will is just a matter of appetite. He talks about real and seeming good, apparent and seeming evil. These aren't in the sense that they're not true. Hobbes says you're just thinking about the future. Something is a seeming good, something is an apparent good, because you're talking about looking into the future, what you think will happen. When you're wrong, Hobbes says, then that's why it's seeming or apparent. It's not because it's not the true good, but because your expectations don't pan out the way that you had hoped or expected. So then at the end of the paragraph, or at the end of the chapter, he sort of sums up what he said about the human good, human happiness, desiring, and so on. So section 58, he says, continual success in obtaining those things which a man from time to time desireth, that is to say, continual prospering, is that men call felicity. I mean the felicity of this life. For there is no such thing as perpetual tranquility of mind while we live here, because life itself is but motion, and can never be without desire, nor without fear, no more than without sense. So again, he says basically because the body is constantly in motion, the mind is constantly in motion, and because the mind is constantly in motion, we're constantly seeing new things, perceiving new things, and constantly desiring and fearing new things. So he says, what is happiness? Is it arriving at the good? Is it attaining the good for human beings? No, Hobbes says, because what seems good to you will constantly be changing. Therefore, happiness isn't pursuing and attaining the good. It's not getting closer to the right state for human beings, like Aquinas would say, for instance. Happiness is simply continual success in getting what you want, realizing that what you want will always change. So remember, for Aquinas, for instance, we talked about if you came into a lot of money, if you inherited a lot of money, but used that money to gratify or to indulge all of your vices, Aquinas would say that's not making you happy. That's making you worse, it's making you unhappy, and so on. Hobbes says no, there's no sort of vice that's inherently bad, virtue that's inherently good. Again, he says that at the beginning of the chapter. There's simply the way that things seem to people, and the way that things seem are constantly changing. So Hobbes says if you get a bunch of money and you can use that money to simply give yourself whatever you want as life goes on, Hobbes says that's happiness. Now, I mean, if you become a drug addict or something and die of an overdose, or you spend all of your money and then you're poor and you're a drug addict, Hobbes might say, well, then very few people will say, yes, this is good, yes, this is happiness. That's poor judgment. That's not making you happy. But if that doesn't happen, if you just continue to sort of live within a certain mean and don't lose everything and don't destroy yourself, but indulge vices and indulge things that Aquinas would say are ultimately vices and sins and so on, Hobbes would say that's happiness. If you keep getting what you want, and what you want will keep changing, so just continually getting what you want, that's happiness. arriving at the good or making progress towards the good, because again, the good, one ultimate good for human beings, or even a series of things that are inherently good for everybody, as opposed to things that are inherently bad. Hobbes says, these things don't exist. This is not the way that the world is.